The rain hammered against the wooden doors of St. Mary's Chapel like an angry fist, each drop carrying the weight of a woman's desperate prayer. Inside, Sarah Mitchell clutched her 3-month-old daughter closer to her chest, her soaked dress clinging to her trembling frame. The candlelight flickered across her tear-stained face as she made the hardest decision of her 22 years. A decision that would change 3 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had never imagined she'd find herself seeking sanctuary in a place she'd avoided for most of her adult life. The small chapel in Millbrook Valley had always seemed like a relic from another time, with its weathered stone walls and simple wooden cross that cast long shadows in the afternoon light. But tonight, with nowhere else to turn and her baby crying from hunger, it felt like the only safe harbor in a storm that had been brewing for months. The story of how she'd arrived at this moment began 6 months earlier, in the bustling town of Cedar Falls, where Sarah worked as a seamstress in Mrs. Abernathy's dress shop. She'd been proud of her small apartment above the bakery, proud of the independence she'd carved out for herself after leaving her family's farm at 18. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was hers until Thomas Bradley walked into the shop one autumn afternoon. Thomas had been everything Sarah thought she wanted. Charming, well-dressed, with promises of a future that sparkled like the engagement ring he slipped onto her finger after just 2 months of courtship. He spoke of taking her to San Francisco, of the grand house they'd share, of the life of comfort that awaited her as his wife. Sarah, who had spent her days bent over fabric and thread, allowed herself to dream of silk gowns and elegant dinners. But Thomas Bradley was a man who collected dreams, the way some men collected stamps temporarily, before moving on to the next interesting specimen. When Sarah told him about the baby growing inside her, his charming smile faltered for just a moment before sliding back into place. "We'll figure it out," he'd said, his hand warm on her cheek. "Trust me, darling." 3 days later he was gone. The boarding house where he'd been staying told her he'd left no forwarding address. The jeweler where she tried to sell the engagement ring informed her it was paste and brass, worth maybe $2. Mrs. Abernathy, upon learning of Sarah's condition, gave her a week's notice with the explanation that decent women wouldn't want their dresses fitted by someone in her situation. Sarah had tried to make it work. She'd taken in washing, mended clothes by lamplight until her eyes burned, and saved every penny she could. But as her belly grew, the work became harder to find. Respectable families didn't want their laundry done by an unwed mother, and the less respectable offers she received made her stomach turn for reasons that had nothing to do with morning sickness. When little Emma was born on a cold February morning, Sarah held her daughter and promised her everything would be all right. But promises don't pay rent or buy milk, and by the time Emma was 3 months old, Sarah was facing eviction with nowhere to go, and no family willing to take them in. Her own parents had made their position clear in the single letter they'd sent. After learning of her situation, "You made your bed, Sarah. We cannot have the shame of your choices reflecting on your younger sisters. Do not come home." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound, but Sarah had folded the letter carefully and placed it in her trunk alongside the few baby clothes she'd managed to buy. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived below the bakery, who told Sarah about Millbrook Valley. "Small town, about 2 days' ride south," she'd said, peeling potatoes in her tiny kitchen while Emma slept in Sarah's arms. "They got good people there. Religious folk, but the kind who actually practice what they preach, if you know what I mean. Town's been growing on account of the railroad coming through, and they always need hard-working folks." Sarah had listened politely, but the idea of starting over in a strange place with a baby and no money seemed impossible. It wasn't until the landlord came knocking the next morning, demanding 3 months back rent or immediate eviction, that Mrs. Henderson's words came flooding back. "Take this," the old woman had said, pressing a small leather pouch into Sarah's hands. "It's not much, but it'll get you there. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better about taking it." The journey to Millbrook Valley had been harder than Sarah anticipated. The stagecoach ride cost most of Mrs. Henderson's money, and Emma cried for much of the trip, earning disapproving looks from the other passengers. By the time they reached the valley, Sarah's last coins had gone to buy milk from a farmhouse along the way. She'd walked into town just as the sun was setting, her carpetbag heavy in one hand, Emma fussing in the other arm. Millbrook Valley was indeed small, a main street lined with modest shops, a few side streets with neat houses, and the chapel standing on a small hill overlooking it all. It looked peaceful, prosperous even, but as Sarah walked down the main street, she realized she had no plan beyond arriving. The hotel looked expensive, and when she peered through the window of the boarding house, the woman inside took one look at her disheveled appearance and shook her head before Sarah could even knock. The general store was closing, and the few people on the street hurried past without making eye contact. It was then that the rain began. At first, it was just a light drizzle that made Sarah pull her shawl tighter around Emma, but within minutes, it had become a downpour that soaked through her worn dress and sent streams of water running down her face. She ducked under the awning of the general store, but the elderly proprietor who was locking up made it clear she couldn't stay there. "Storm's going to be a bad one," he'd said, not unkindly but firmly. "You'd best find somewhere proper to shelter." With nowhere else to go, and Emma beginning to cry from the cold and wet, Sarah had looked up at the chapel on the hill. She'd never been particularly religious. Her family had attended church more out of social obligation than devotion, but the building looked solid and welcoming in a way that nothing else in town had. The walk up the hill felt like the longest of her life. Each step seemed to require more effort than she had left to give, and by the time she reached the heavy wooden doors, she was stumbling more than walking. The doors were unlocked, and she pushed inside, immediately feeling the relief of dry air and shelter. The interior was simple but beautiful, with rows of wooden pews facing a modest altar. Candles provided the only light, casting everything in a warm golden glow that made Sarah feel safer than she had in months. She sank into the back pew, adjusting Emma in her arms and trying to quiet her cries. Little one," she whispered. "We're safe now. We're going to be just fine." But even as she said the words, Sarah wasn't sure she believed them. She had perhaps 50 cents left to her name, no prospects for work, and no place to stay. The chapel might provide shelter for one night, but morning would come, and with it, all the same problems that had driven her here. She must have dozed, because the next thing she knew, Emma's cries were echoing off the chapel walls, hungry and urgent. Sarah tried to soothe her, but the baby had been fed hours ago and wouldn't be comforted. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet space, and Sarah felt a flush of shame at disturbing the peace of the sacred building. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty air, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to God, to the building itself, or to her daughter for bringing her to such desperate circumstances. It was as she sat there, rocking Emma and trying to think of what to do next, that she heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor behind her. Sarah turned, expecting to see a minister or caretaker who would politely but firmly ask her to leave. Instead, she saw a man standing in the doorway, water dripping from his hat and coat. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long days outdoors. His clothes marked him as a working man, worn but clean denim, boots that had seen plenty of use, and a hat that had protected him through countless storms. What struck Sarah most, though, was his eyes. They were kind eyes, the sort that seemed to take in everything without judgment. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the chapel. "I hope I'm not intruding." Sarah clutched Emma closer, suddenly aware of how she must look bedraggled, desperate, clearly out of place. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I know I shouldn't be here, but the storm—" He held up a hand, stopping her explanation. "No need to apologize. House of God is meant for folks who need shelter." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm Jake Morrison. I help take care of this place, make repairs and such. Came to check that the roof wasn't leaking with this storm." "Sarah," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "Sarah Mitchell. And this is Emma." Jake nodded, his gaze moving to the baby in her arms. Rough night to be traveling with a little one. There was no condemnation in his voice, no curiosity about why a woman and baby were alone in a chapel during a storm. Just a simple statement of fact that somehow made Sarah feel less like she needed to defend herself. "We're just passing through," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded hollow. "Passing through to where? With what money?" Jake seemed to sense the uncertainty behind her words. He moved closer, his boots quiet on the wooden floor, and Sarah noticed he had the kind of careful way of moving that suggested he was used to dealing with nervous animals or people. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the pew across the aisle. Sarah nodded, and he settled himself with the same quiet efficiency that marked all his movements. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain against the windows and Emma's gradually quieting fussles. "Been caring for this place for about 5 years now," Jake said eventually. "See all kinds of folks come through these doors. Some are just visiting, some are running from something, and some are looking for something they can't quite put a name to." He paused, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "All of them are welcome." There was something in his tone that made Sarah believe him, and for the first time in months, she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen just slightly. Here was a man who seemed to understand that sometimes life left you with no good choices, only necessary ones. "I don't know how long we'll be staying in town," Sarah said carefully. "I'm looking for work, somewhere to settle down and raise Emma properly." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake nodded, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "Millbrook Valleys. A good place for that. Growing town, decent folks. Always need people willing to work hard." He stood up, and Sarah felt a moment of panic that he was leaving, that this brief moment of kindness was over. But instead, he walked to a small closet near the altar and returned with a clean blanket. "Gets cold here at night," he said, offering it to her. "This should help keep the little one warm." Sarah accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around Emma, who had finally fallen asleep. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than any thanks she'd ever given. "Nothing to thank me for," Jake replied. "We all need help sometimes." The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor where Sarah had spent the night. She woke to the sound of Emma stirring in her arms and the distant clatter of wagon wheels on the main street below. Her body ached from sleeping upright in the pew, but for the first time in weeks, she felt rested. Jake Morrison had returned just after dawn, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a cloth bundle that smelled like fresh bread. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to wake them, but Emma's soft coosh drew his attention to the back pew where Sarah was slowly sitting up, trying to work the stiffness from her neck. "Morning," he said simply, setting the coffee and bundle on the pew beside her. "Figured you might be hungry." Sarah's stomach responded before she could, growling loudly enough to make her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "You didn't have to, Martha." "Henley runs the bakery down on Main Street," Jake interrupted gently. "Makes the best biscuits in 3 counties. She always has extra, and she doesn't like seeing them go to waste." The bread was still warm, and Sarah had to force herself to eat slowly despite the gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion for days. The coffee was strong and hot, chasing away the last remnants of the night's chill. As she ate, Jake busied himself checking the windows for storm damage, giving her space while somehow managing to make his presence feel reassuring rather than intrusive. The storm caused some flooding down by Miller's Creek, he said, examining a window. Latch. Nothing too serious, but it'll keep the stage from coming through for a day or two. Sarah felt a flutter of panic. She'd been counting on the stage to take her somewhere else if Millbrook Valley didn't work out, though she hadn't admitted to herself that she had no money for passage. I see, she managed. Jake turned from the window, his weathered hands gentle, as he adjusted his hat. Gives folks time to get settled, I suppose. Sometimes the best opportunities come when you're not rushing toward the next town. There was wisdom in his words that Sarah couldn't quite grasp yet, but something about the way he said it made her feel like staying might not be the desperate move she'd thought it was. I should find work, she said, more to herself than to him. There must be something I can do to earn my keep. What kind of work did you do before? Jake asked, settling into the pew across from her with the easy comfort of a man who belonged in this place. Seamstress mostly. I worked in a dress shop, did alterations, made simple garments. Sarah shifted Emma to her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. I'm good with my hands, and I learn quickly. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Eleanor Whitman. Runs the finest dress shop this side of Denver. Just opened a new location here last month when the railroad announced they'd be putting a station in Millbrook Valley. She's been looking for skilled help. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest, but years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious. Would she hire someone like me? Someone skilled and hardworking? Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. Don't see why not. Someone with a baby and no husband, Sarah clarified quietly. Jake was silent for a long moment, and Sarah braced herself for the careful retreat she'd seen so many times before. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and sure. Eleanor Whitman lost her own husband 2 years ago. Kept his business running and expanded it because she had to feed her 3 children. She's not the kind of woman who judges others for doing what they must to survive. The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. She'd grown so used to being seen as a cautionary tale, a woman who'd made poor choices and deserved whatever hardship followed. The idea that someone might see her simply as a person trying to build a life felt almost too good to believe. Where would we stay? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. There's a boarding house for working women on Elm Street. Clean, safe, reasonable rates. Mrs. Patterson, who runs it, has helped plenty of young mothers get back on their feet. Jake stood up, his movements decisive. Why don't I introduce you to Eleanor? See if you two might be a good fit for each other. An hour later, Sarah found herself walking down Main Street with Jake, Emma content in her arms and her few possessions in the carpetbag at her side. The town looked different in daylight, smaller than she'd expected, but prosperous and well-maintained. The buildings were a mix of weathered wood and newer construction, suggesting a community that honored its past while embracing growth. Eleanor Whitman's shop occupied the corner building where Main Street met the newer commercial district. The large windows displayed fashionable dresses that would have impressed even the sophisticated customers back in Cedar Falls. Sarah felt a familiar thrill at seeing fine fabrics and expert construction, the same feeling that had drawn her to seamstress work in the first place. Eleanor herself was a woman of about 40, with steel gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and keen blue eyes that missed nothing. She looked up from pinning a hem as Jake and Sarah entered, her gaze taking in Sarah's worn dress and the baby in her arms, without any change in her polite expression. Jake Morrison, she said warmly. What brings you to my shop this fine morning? Eleanor, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell. She's new in town and happens to be one of the finest seamstresses I've ever had the pleasure to encounter. Sarah shot him a look of surprise. They'd never discussed the quality of her work, but Eleanor was already moving closer. Her experienced eye-examining the careful mending Sarah had done on her own dress, the neat stitching that held her carpetbag together. "Those are precise stitches," Eleanor observed. "Where did you train?" "Mrs. Abernathy's shop in Cedar Falls," Sarah replied. "I worked there for 3 years, did everything from simple alterations to custom gowns for the banker's wife." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Abernathy's has a good reputation." "What brings you to Millbrook Valley?" Sarah hesitated, but Jake's steady presence behind her gave her courage to tell the truth. "I'm looking for a fresh start. Somewhere I can raise my daughter and build a good life for both of us." "Admirable goals," Eleanor said simply. "Can you show me your work? I have some alterations that need attention." For the next hour, Sarah found herself in the familiar rhythm of measuring, pinning, and stitching. Her hands remembered the comfortable weight of good scissors, the satisfaction of a perfectly straight seam. Eleanor watched without comment as Sarah adjusted a sleeve, took in a waistline, and hemmed a skirt with the efficiency that came from years of practice. "Your technique is excellent," Eleanor finally said. "Clean, fast, professional. I could use someone with your skills." Sarah's heart leaped, but she forced herself to stay calm. What would the position entail? Full-time seamstress, handling alterations and simple construction. "I'd start you at $8 a week, with the possibility of advancement as the business grows." Eleanor paused, glancing at Emma, who had been remarkably quiet throughout the interview. "You'd need reliable childcare during working hours." $8 a week was more than Sarah had dared hope for. "I'm sure I can arrange something." Actually, Jake spoke up from where he'd been examining a display of buttons. "My sister Ruth has been watching children for working mothers. She's got a little one of her own, and she's been looking for a way to earn some extra money while staying home." Eleanor smiled. "Ruth Morrison is a treasure. Your daughter would be in excellent hands." Sarah felt the pieces of a new life clicking into place with startling speed. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning, if you're ready." The railroad. Workers get paid on Fridays, and their wives always come in over the weekend for alterations to their Sunday best. Eleanor extended her hand. "Welcome to Millbrook Valley, Sarah." The boarding house on Elm Street was a 3-story white building with green shutters and a wraparound porch where several women sat enjoying the afternoon sunshine. Mrs. Patterson, a motherly woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, showed Sarah to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Rent's $3 a week, includes breakfast and Sunday dinner," she explained, opening the window to let in fresh air. "Most of the girls who live here work in town, the schoolteacher. 2 shop clerks and a nurse. Quiet, respectable young women trying to make their way in the world." The room contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small dresser with a mirror above it. It was sparse but spotless, with cheerful yellow curtains and a quilt that looked handmade. Sarah set Emma on the bed and felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the sense of being home. "There's a cradle in the storage room that you're welcome to use," Mrs. Patterson added. "The last young mother who stayed here left it behind when she got married and moved to her own place." That evening, Sarah sat in the boarding house's common room with Emma on her lap, listening to the other residents share stories of their day. Miss Caroline taught at the elementary school and regaled them with tales of her students' antics. Alice worked at the general store and knew everyone's business, though she shared it with good humor rather than malice. Rebecca, the nurse head, spent the day helping Doc Henley deliver twins to a farming family outside town. "What about you, Sarah?" Caroline asked. "How was your first day in Millbrook Valley?" Sarah bounced Emma gently, still hardly able to believe her change in fortune. "I found work at Eleanor Whitman's dress shop. I start tomorrow." "Eleanor's wonderful," Alice said enthusiastically. "She made my sister's wedding dress last year, most beautiful thing you have ever saw. You'll like working for her." "And Jake Morrison helped me get settled," Sarah added. "He's been very kind." The room fell silent for a moment and Sarah wondered if she'd said something wrong. Then Rebecca smiled warmly. "Jake's one of the good ones. Lost his wife about 4 years ago in a riding accident. He's been quiet since then, keeps mostly to himself, except for his work at the chapel and helping folks when they need it." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for the man who'd shown her such kindness. She'd assumed his gentleness came from natural temperament, not from understanding what it meant to face loss and hardship. "He never talks about it," Caroline added softly. "But Mrs. Henderson says he and his wife were planning to start a family when she died. Some folks think that's why he's always helping people, especially women and children who need a hand." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sarah found herself thinking about Jake Morrison as she settled Emma in the borrowed cradle that night. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her daughter, a softness that spoke of dreams. Deferred rather than dreams never held. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp air that promised autumn wasn't far away. Sarah dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, pinned her hair back neatly, and made her way to Eleanor's shop with Emma in her arms. Ruth Morrison was waiting outside, a young woman with Jake's same kind eyes and gentle manner. "You must be Sarah," Ruth said with a warm smile. "Jake told me all about you and this beautiful baby. I'm so excited to have another little one to care for." Ruth's house was a short walk from the dress shop, a neat cottage with a white picket fence, and a garden full of late summer flowers. Inside, Sarah met Ruth's 18-month-old son, David, a cheerful toddler who immediately seemed fascinated by Emma. "She'll be perfectly safe here," Ruth assured her. "I have everything she might need, and if there's any problem at all, I'll send David's father to fetch you right away." Sarah handed Emma over with the mixture of anxiety and relief that every working mother knew. Her daughter would be cared for, loved even, while Sarah earned the money to build them a future. The morning at Eleanor's shop flew by in a blur of familiar tasks. Sarah altered 3 dresses, hemmed 2 skirts, and helped Eleanor cut fabric for a custom gown that would be the talk of the town when completed. The work felt like coming home to herself, remembering who she'd been before desperation had stripped away everything she'd thought she knew about her life. At noon, Eleanor suggested Sarah take her lunch break and check on Emma. "New mothers worry," she said with understanding. "Go put your mind at ease." Sarah found Emma content in Ruth's arms, both babies napping peacefully in the afternoon sunshine that streamed through the cottage windows. Ruth had prepared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and cold meat, insisting that Sarah needed to keep up her strength. "She's an angel," Ruth said, adjusting Emma's blanket. "Hardly made a sound all morning. David's quite taken with her, keeps patting her head and babbling at her." As Sarah walked back to the shop, she realized that for the first time since Thomas Bradley had walked out of her life, she wasn't thinking about what might go wrong. Instead, she was thinking about what might go right about the dresses she would sew, the money she would save, the life she would build for herself and her daughter in this unexpected haven. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, and Sarah marveled at Eleanor's skill in managing both the business side of the shop and the delicate art of making every woman feel beautiful in the clothes they chose. By closing time, Sarah's fingers were sore from sewing, but it was the good soreness of productive work rather than the desperate ache of too little food and too much worry. "You did excellent work today," Eleanor said as they closed up the shop. "I think we're going to make a fine team." Walking back to collect Emma, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. The future, which had seemed so uncertain just 24 hours ago, now held the promise of stability, respectability, and the chance to be the mother she'd always wanted to be. But as she turned the corner onto Ruth Street, she saw a familiar figure waiting by the garden gate. Jake Morrison stood there with his hat in his hands, and something in his posture made Sarah quicken her pace. "Is everything all right?" she asked as she reached him. Jake's expression was troubled. "Ruth asked me to wait for you." There's been some news from town that you need to hear." Sarah's blood turned cold at the expression on Jake's face. She'd grown accustomed to reading trouble in people's eyes over the past months, and whatever news he carried was significant enough to send him looking for her personally. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced toward Ruth's cottage where lamplight glowed warmly in the windows. "Maybe we should sit down for this." They settled on Ruth's front porch swing, the evening air carrying the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields beyond town. Jake turned his hat over in his hands, clearly struggling with how to begin. "A man came through town this afternoon asking questions," he finally said. "Well-dressed fellow, claimed to be looking for a young woman traveling with a baby. Said he was her intended husband, worried sick about her welfare." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, fancy clothes. Had the kind of smooth way of talking that makes some folks want to help him and others want to count their pocket change after he leaves." Jake's eyes met hers. "Name of Thomas Bradley." The porch swing seemed to sway more than the gentle evening breeze warranted. Sarah gripped the armrest, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Thomas had found her. Somehow. Despite her careful attempts to cover her tracks, he'd followed her trail to Millbrook Valley. "What did you tell him?" she managed. "Nothing," Jake said firmly. "But I wasn't the only one he talked to. He spent considerable time at the hotel, bought drinks for half the men in the saloon, and had a long conversation with Mrs. Carmichael. At the general store." Sarah knew Mrs. Carmichael by reputation already. Alice at the boarding house had warned the other women that the storekeeper's wife had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. If Thomas had charmed information out of her, Sarah's carefully built new life could crumble before it had truly begun. "Did he say what he wanted?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Jake's expression darkened. "Claims you ran off with his child after some lover's quarrel. Says he's been searching for weeks, desperate to bring his family home where they belong." The lies came so easily to Thomas that Sarah wondered if he'd begun to believe them himself. She stood abruptly, pacing to the porch railing where she gripped the painted wood until her knuckles went white. "It's not true," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Emma is his daughter, but he's not her father in any way that matters. He left us with nothing when I told him about the baby. I haven't seen him since." "I figured as much," Jake said quietly. "Man's got the look of someone who's never taken responsibility for anything in his life." Sarah turned to face him, struck by the certainty in his voice. "You believed me that quickly?" "Seen enough of the world to know the difference between someone running from trouble and someone running from harm," Jake replied. "Question is, what do you want to do about it?" The simple question hit Sarah with unexpected force. For months, she'd felt like life was something that happened to her rather than something she had any control over. Thomas had made choices that affected her. Mrs. Abernathy had made decisions about her employment. Her parents had decided she was no longer welcome. But Jake was asking what she wanted to do, as if her desires and decisions mattered. "I want to stay," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her conviction. "I want to raise Emma here. Work at Eleanor's shop, build a life that's ours. But I don't know if Thomas will let me." Jake stood and moved to lean against the porch post, his weathered face thoughtful. "What hold does he have over you legally?" "None that I know of. We were never married, despite what he told people in town today. He has no legal claim to Emma." Sarah paused, considering. "But he's charming and persuasive. If he convinces people that I'm some kind of fallen woman who stole his child, then we make sure people know the truth before his lies take root," Jake said with quiet determination. The front door opened, and Ruth appeared, Emma in her arms and a concerned expression on her face. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said apologetically. "David's finally asleep, and I was bringing Emma out for some fresh air when I heard voices." Sarah reached for her daughter, taking comfort in the baby's warm weight against her chest. Emma looked up at her with Thomas's dark eyes, but everything else about her was pure innocence, a fresh start made manifest in tiny fingers and sleepy sighs. "What's this about someone claiming to be Emma's father?" Ruth asked, settling into the chair beside the swing. Jake quickly filled his sister in on Thomas's arrival and his claims about Sarah. Ruth's expression grew steadily more indignant as the story unfolded. "The nerve of that man," she said when Jake finished. "Sarah, you can't let him take you back to whatever situation you escaped from." "I don't intend to," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure how she could prevent it if Thomas decided to make trouble. "But if he's convinced people that I'm some kind of criminal ... then we'll unconvince them," Ruth said practically. "Eleanor Whitman carries considerable influence in this town, and she's already seen your character for herself. Doc Henley delivered Emma, I assume? He'll be able to speak to the timing if anyone questions the baby's parentage." Sarah shook her head. "Emma was born in Cedar Falls. Doc Henley's never seen either of us before yesterday." "But I have, Jake," sighed thoughtfully, "and I've got a reputation for straight dealing in this town. My word carries weight with the people who matter." "You do that?" Sarah asked, touched by his willingness to involve himself in her troubles. "You barely know me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Sarah to Emma and back. Again, when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of conviction that made Sarah believe every word. "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're a woman trying to build an honest life for herself and her child. I know you work hard and don't ask for charity. I know you've got courage enough to start over in a strange place with nothing but hope to sustain you." He paused, adjusting his hat. "And I know that whatever Thomas Bradley's after, it's not about love or family responsibility." The next morning brought an early test of the town's loyalties. Sarah arrived at Eleanor's shop to find a small crowd gathered outside, their voices carrying the excited buzz that accompanied fresh gossip. Thomas Bradley stood in the center of the group, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as clearly from somewhere more sophisticated than Millbrook Valley. He looked exactly as Sarah remembered, handsome in a practiced way, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that had once made her heart race. Now seeing him hold court with the townspeople while weaving his web of lies, she felt only disgust and a cold fear for what his presence might mean for her newfound stability. "There she is," Thomas called out as Sarah approached, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "Sarah, darling, I've been so worried about you." Every instinct told Sarah to run, but she forced herself to walk steadily toward the shop. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. "Miss Mitchell," Eleanor said formally, "you're right on time. Shall we begin our day?" But Thomas was already moving toward her, his arms outstretched as if expecting an embrace. "Sarah, sweetheart, what's this about? Why did you run away from me? From us?" Sarah stepped back, putting the shop's doorway between herself and Thomas. "I didn't run away from anything, Mr. Bradley. I left a situation that was untenable." "Don't be stubborn, darling," Thomas said, his tone patient but with an edge that Sarah recognized from their final conversations in Cedar Falls. "You know, you can't manage on your own with the baby. Come home with me and we'll forget this whole misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Sarah replied, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. "You made your position clear when you disappeared without a word. I've made mine clear by building a new life here." A murmur went through the gathered crowd. Sarah could see uncertainty on some faces. Thomas's performance was convincing, and her situation did look suspicious to those who didn't know the full story. "Now, Sarah," Thomas said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You're upset, and I understand that, but our daughter needs both her parents. Surely these good people can see that a child belongs with her father. Emma, Belongs with the parent who wanted her, Sarah said firmly. The parent who's cared for her since birth. The parent who didn't abandon her when times got difficult. Thomas's mask slipped for just a moment, his eyes flashing with anger before the charming smile returned. You're being dramatic, sweetheart. I had business to attend to, arrangements to make for our future. I never abandoned you. You left in the middle of the night with no forwarding address, Sarah shot back. You left me to face eviction, to find work while pregnant, to give birth alone. That's not business, Mr. Bradley. That's abandonment. Eleanor stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. Mr. Bradley, is it? I'm Eleanor Whitman, Sarah's employer. Perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a private setting rather than a public spectacle. Thomas turned his charm toward Eleanor, but Sarah could see that the older woman was immune to his practiced appeal. Mrs. Whitman, I appreciate your concern for Sarah's welfare. It speaks well of your character. But surely you can understand a man's desire to reunite with his family. I understand many desires, Mr. Bradley, Eleanor replied coolly. Not all of them are in the best interest of everyone involved. The crowd was beginning to disperse, sensing that the excitement was over for the moment. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Thomas hadn't tracked her to Millbrook Valley to give up at the first sign of resistance. We'll continue this conversation later, Sarah, Thomas said, tipping his hat to Eleanor. When you've had time to think clearly about what's best for our daughter. As he walked away, Sarah felt her legs trembling with the effort of standing upright. Eleanor ushered her into the shop, closing the door firmly behind them. Sit down before you fall down, Eleanor commanded, guiding Sarah to a chair behind the counter. That man has trouble with a capital T. He's going to cause problems for you, Sarah said, her voice shaking. For your business, your reputation. Maybe I should. Should what? Let a smooth-talking scoundrel drive you out of town. Eleanor's eyes flashed with indignation. Not while I have breath in my body. You're a good woman, Sarah Mitchell, and a skilled seamstress. That's all that matters to me. The morning passed in a blur of customers and work, but Sarah could feel the weight of curious glances and whispered conversations. Thomas had planted his seeds of doubt, and she could only hope that the truth would prove stronger than his lies. It was just after noon when Jake appeared at the shop, his face grim. We need to talk, he said without preamble. Sarah's heart sank. What's happened now? Bradley's been busy, Jake said. He's rented a room at the hotel and settled in like he plans to stay a while. Word is he's hired a lawyer from Denver, claims. He's going to file papers to get custody of Emma. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Can he do that? Depends on what he can prove and what story he tells, Jake replied honestly. But there's something else. Sheriff Morrison, no relation. Despite the name, wants to talk to you. Seems Bradley's convinced him that you might be guilty of kidnapping. Eleanor made a sound of disgust. Kidnapping her own child? That's ridiculous. Maybe so, Jake said. But the sheriff has to investigate any formal complaint. He's a fair man, but he's also bound by the law. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, Emma's future suddenly feeling as precarious as it had been the night she'd sought shelter in the chapel. When does he want to see me? This afternoon. I'll come with you if you'd like. The offer of support should have been comforting, but Sarah found herself wondering if Jake's involvement might only make things worse. If Thomas succeeded in painting her as some kind of criminal, anyone associated with her could suffer consequences. You don't have to do that, she began, but Jake cut her off with a shake of his head. Yes, I do, he said simply. Sometimes standing up for what's right is the only choice a person can make. As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Sarah couldn't help but think that she was about to discover whether Millbrook Valley would truly be the fresh start she'd hoped for, or just another place where Thomas Bradley's charm could destroy the life she was trying to build. Sheriff Daniel Hayes was not what Sarah had expected. A man in his 50s with graying hair and weathered hands. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen enough of human nature to make fair judgments without rushing to conclusions. His office was sparse but organized, with wanted posters tacked to one wall and a coffee pot that looked like it had seen better decades steaming on a corner table. "Miss Mitchell," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I appreciate you coming in voluntarily. Makes things easier for everyone involved." Jake took the chair beside Sarah, his presence steady and reassuring despite the gravity of the situation. Emma slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, oblivious to the legal storm brewing around her young life. "Sheriff Hayes," Sarah began, then paused, unsure how to defend herself against accusations she didn't fully understand. "Let me start by saying I've known Jake Morrison for the better part of a decade," the sheriff said, settling behind his desk. "He's not given to supporting folks who don't deserve it. That carries weight with me, but I still need to hear your side of things." Sarah took a breath and began her story from the beginning, meeting Thomas in Cedar Falls, their brief courtship, his disappearance when she told him about the baby, and her journey to Millbrook Valley seeking a fresh start. She spoke clearly and honestly, leaving out nothing that might be relevant to the accusations Thomas had made. Sheriff Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper. When Sarah finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with keen eyes. "That's quite a different tale from what Mr. Bradley told me this morning," he said finally. "According to him, you two were engaged to be married, had a disagreement about wedding plans, and you disappeared with his child out of spite." "That's not true," Sarah said firmly. "We were never formally engaged, and he left me, not the other way around." "Any proof of that? Letters, witnesses, anything that might support your version of events?" Sarah's heart sank. She'd destroyed the few letters Thomas had written her in a fit of anger after he left, and Mrs. Abernathy was hardly likely to provide character references given how she dismissed Sarah from her employment. "Mrs. Henderson," Jake said suddenly. "The elderly woman who lived below Sarah's apartment in Cedar Falls. She saw Bradley leave in the middle of the night, helped Sarah when she had nowhere else to turn. One witness, and not here to testify," Sheriff Hayes mused. "Mr. Bradley, on the other hand, has brought a document he claims is a marriage certificate from a justice of the peace in Colorado Springs." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. "That's impossible. I've never been to Colorado Springs, and I certainly never married Thomas Bradley." The sheriff opened a drawer and withdrew a folded paper, spreading it carefully on the desk. Even upside down, Sarah could see official-looking seals and signatures, her own name written in what looked remarkably like her handwriting next to Thomas's bold scrawl. "This is a forgery," she said, her voice rising with panic. "I never signed that document. I've never even seen it before." Sheriff Hayes examined the paper carefully. "It looks authentic to me, Miss Mitchell. Got the right seals, proper signatures, even lists witnesses." "Witnesses who probably don't exist," Jake said grimly. "Or who were paid to lie." "That's a serious accusation, Jake. You got any proof of that?" Before Jake could answer, the office door burst open and Thomas Bradley strode in without knocking. His earlier charm had been replaced by righteous indignation, and he carried himself like a man confident of victory. "Sheriff Hayes, I trust you've had time to review the evidence I provided," he said, barely glancing at Sarah and Jake. "As you can see, my wife has been filling your ears with lies about our marriage." "I am not your wife," Sarah said, standing abruptly and causing Emma to stir in her arms. "That document is a fake, and you know it." Thomas's eyes hardened, but his voice remained level. "Sarah, darling, I know you're upset about our argument, but denying our marriage won't change the facts. We were wed in Colorado Springs 6 months ago, witnessed by the Reverend Matthews and his wife. Surely you remember the lovely ceremony?" The detail was so specific, delivered with such conviction, that Sarah saw doubt flicker across Sheriff Hayes's face. Thomas had always been a masterful liar, but this performance was beyond anything she'd witnessed before. "I've never been to Colorado Springs," Sarah repeated, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "The altitude made you dizzy," Thomas continued smoothly. "You said it was the most beautiful wedding you could have imagined, despite the simple setting. We honeymooned at the Broadmoor Hotel for 3 days before returning to Cedar Falls." Sarah stared at him in horror. He was weaving details into his lies that made them sound almost believable, creating a false history with the skill of a practiced con man. "This is ridiculous," Jake said, his voice tight with anger. "Sheriff, you've known me long enough to trust my judgment. This man is lying." "I appreciate your loyalty to my wife, Mr. Morrison," Thomas said with oily sympathy. "But surely you can understand that a marriage certificate carries more weight than the word of a woman who's clearly been filling your head with stories." The casual way Thomas dismissed her as unreliable made Sarah's vision blur with rage. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Sheriff, I think I might be able to help clarify a few things." Everyone turned to see a small, elderly man standing in the doorway. He wore a dusty black suit and carried a worn leather satchel, his white hair neatly combed despite obvious signs of recent travel. "Reverend Matthews," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled. "What a pleasant surprise. I didn't expect to see you so far from Colorado Springs." "I'll bet you didn't," the old man replied dryly, stepping into the office. "Sheriff Hayes and Reverend William Matthews from Colorado Springs. I understand there's been some confusion about a marriage certificate bearing my signature." Sheriff Hayes gestured to an empty chair. "Please, Reverend, have a seat. Mr. Bradley here has presented a marriage certificate that claims you performed the ceremony for him and Miss Mitchell." Reverend Matthews settled himself carefully and opened his satchel, withdrawing a thick ledger. "I keep meticulous records of every ceremony I perform, Sheriff. Every wedding, baptism, and funeral for the past 30 years. He flipped through pages with practiced efficiency. 6 months ago, you say? Let me check." The silence in the office was deafening as the Reverend ran his finger down column after column of entries. Thomas had gone very still, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Interesting," Reverend Matthews said finally. "According to my records, I performed no marriages during the week in question. In fact, I was visiting my sister in Kansas during that entire month, recovering from a bout of pneumonia that kept me bedridden for 6 weeks." "That's impossible," Thomas said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You must be mistaken about the dates." "I'm quite certain of the dates, young man. My sister's letters documenting my illness are on file with the church board, along with the temporary minister's reports from that period." The Reverend's eyes were sharp as they fixed on Thomas. "More importantly, I've never seen either of these young people before in my life." Sheriff Hayes picked up the marriage certificate and examined it more closely. If Reverend Matthews didn't perform this ceremony, then someone forged his signature along with everything else. "That's a federal crime," Jake pointed out quietly. "Forging official documents, impersonating a minister." Thomas made a move toward the door, but Sheriff Hayes was already on his feet. "Mr. Bradley, I think you'd better sit back down. We've got some serious questions to discuss." "This is all a misunderstanding," Thomas said, but sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Perhaps I was confused about which minister performed the ceremony. It was a very emotional time." "Emotional enough to forget who married you, Reverend?" Matthews asked skeptically. "Son, I've been performing weddings for 40 years. Folks might forget what they wore or what they ate, but they remember who spoke the words that joined them together." Sarah felt a surge of relief so strong it made her knees weak. Jake's hand on her shoulder steadied her as the truth finally began to emerge from the web of lies Thomas had spun. "There's more, Sheriff," Reverend Matthews continued, pulling another document from his satchel. When I heard about this supposed marriage certificate, I did some investigating of my own. Turns out Mr. Bradley has been quite busy in recent months. He handed Sheriff Hayes a telegram. That's from Sheriff Coleman in Cedar Falls. Seems Mr. Bradley left town owing money to several businesses and is suspected of selling shares in a mining operation that doesn't exist. There's a warrant out for his arrest on charges of fraud. Thomas bolted for the door, but Jake was faster. The Cowboy's work-hardened muscles made quick work of restraining the smaller man, pinning him against the wall with efficient ease. "Let me go," Thomas snarled, his polished veneer finally cracking completely. "You have no right to hold me." "Actually, I do," Sheriff Hayes said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Forging legal documents, filing false reports, and now it looks like fraud charges from another jurisdiction. You're going to be my guest for quite a while, Mr. Bradley." As the sheriff secured the handcuffs, Thomas turned to Sarah with a look of pure venom. "You think you've won something here? You're still nothing but a fallen woman with a bastard child. No decent man will ever want you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Jake stepped forward. His voice was quiet but carried a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. "You're wrong about that, Bradley. Dead wrong." Something in Jake's tone made Sarah look at him sharply. There was a determination in his eyes that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed. "Sarah Mitchell is one of the finest women I've ever known," Jake continued, his gaze never leaving Thomas's face. "She's honest, hardworking, and brave enough to start over when life knocked her down. Any man would be lucky to call her his wife." The last word hung in the air like a promise, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Was Jake saying what she thought he was saying? "In fact," Jake continued, turning to face Sarah directly, "I'd be honored if she'd consider marrying me. If she have me, that is." The office fell completely silent except for the sound of Emma's soft breathing and the distant noise of the street outside. Sarah stared at Jake, hardly able to believe what she'd just heard. "Jake," she whispered, "you don't have to. I'm not doing this out of obligation," he said firmly, moving closer to her. "I'm doing it because somewhere between watching you sleep in that chapel pew and seeing you stand up to this snake, I realized I'd fallen in love with both you and Emma. If you'll have us, we could build something real together." Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat. "Well, this has been quite an afternoon. Mr. Bradley, you're under arrest. Miss Mitchell, congratulations on your engagement, if that's what this is." Sarah looked at Jake's weathered face, at the honesty in his eyes, and the gentle way he reached out to touch Emma's tiny hand. This wasn't the romantic proposal she'd once dreamed of, but it was something better, a partnership, offered by a man who'd seen her at her lowest point and chosen to stand beside her anyway. "Yes," she said softly, then stronger. "Yes, Jake Morrison. I'll marry you." As Sheriff Hayes led Thomas away in handcuffs, Sarah found herself holding both her daughter and the hand of the man who just offered them both a future neither of them had dared to hope for. The chapel where she'd sought shelter just days ago would soon witness a very different kind of ceremony, one that promised beginnings instead of endings, hope instead of desperation. Thomas's final threat echoed in her mind, but looking at Jake's steady smile and feeling Emma's warm weight in her arms, Sarah knew that some victories were worth fighting for. And some men were worth trusting with your heart. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the occasion. She stood before the mirror in her room at the boarding house, adjusting the pearl buttons on the dress that Eleanor had insisted on making as a wedding gift, a creation of cream silk and delicate lace that transformed Sarah from a desperate woman seeking shelter into a radiant bride. "You look beautiful," Ruth said from the doorway, Emma content in her arms wearing a tiny dress of matching cream silk. "Jake's going to forget how to speak when he sees you." 3 weeks had passed since that dramatic afternoon in Sheriff Hayes's office. 3 weeks of whirlwind preparations that had swept Sarah along like a leaf in a favorable wind. The engagement had caused quite a stir in Millbrook Valley, but the revelation of Thomas Bradley's crimes had quickly shifted public opinion in Sarah's favor. Nothing convinced a community of someone's character quite like seeing them vindicated. Against a smooth-talking scoundrel. Eleanor had thrown herself into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign, declaring that any woman brave enough to stand up to Thomas Bradley deserved a celebration worthy of a queen. The boarding house ladies had contributed their various talents. Caroline had arranged the flowers, Alice had coordinated the reception menu, and Rebecca had somehow procured a 3-tiered cake from Denver that was currently the talk of the town. "I can't believe this is really happening," Sarah said, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. 3 weeks ago, I was sleeping in a chapel pew with no hope of a future. Now ... Now you're marrying the best man in 3 counties, Ruth finished firmly. And before you start worrying about whether you deserve this happiness, let me remind you that Jake hasn't smiled this much since before his first wife died. You're not just getting a husband, Sarah, you're giving him back his joy. The words touched Sarah more deeply than she'd expected. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, she'd worried constantly about whether she was being fair to Jake, whether he was proposing out of pity rather than love, whether she was taking advantage of his kind nature. But she'd seen the change in him too, the way his eyes lit up when he looked at Emma, the gentle humor that emerged when he felt comfortable, the quiet contentment that seemed to settle over him whenever the 3 of them were together. Their courtship had been necessarily brief but surprisingly thorough. Jake visited every evening after work, sometimes bringing small gifts, a rattle carved from wood for Emma, wildflowers for Sarah, fresh milk from his neighbor's cow. They'd walked the streets of Millbrook Valley in the golden light of evening, talking about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Sarah had learned that Jake's first wife, Mary, had been his childhood sweetheart, and that her death in a riding accident had left him convinced he'd never love again. He'd told her about the small ranch he owned just outside town, the horses he raised, and the quiet life he'd built around work and responsibility rather than hope. "I thought I was done with dreams," he'd confided one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, Emma sleeping between them. "But watching you fight for your future, seeing how you refuse to let circumstances break you, it made me remember what it felt like to believe in tomorrow." Now, as Sarah prepared to walk down the aisle of St. Mary's Chapel, she felt the weight of that trust and the magnitude of the chance they were taking together. Marriage was always a leap of faith, but theirs was also a leap of healing too. Wounded people choosing to build something new rather than remain trapped by their past disappointments. Knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Patterson appeared, her face flushed with excitement and her best dress adorned with a corsage that Alice had insisted was absolutely necessary for the occasion. "Sarah, dear, it's time. The chapel is overflowing. I don't think there's a soul in town who isn't here to see you married." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. She'd grown comfortable in Millbrook Valley, but the idea of being the center of attention still made her stomach twist with anxiety. "They're not here to judge you," Ruth said, reading her expression with sisterly accuracy. "They're here to celebrate. Half the women in town see you as proof that second chances are possible, and the other half just love a good wedding." The walk to the chapel felt both endless and far too short. Sarah's small wedding party, Ruth as matron of honor, Eleanor as her sponsor, and little Emma as an unconventional but beloved addition, made their way up the hill through streets lined with well-wishers. Children threw flower petals, women called out blessings, and even the men who'd initially been skeptical of the newcomer tipped their hats respectfully. The chapel doors stood open, revealing an interior transformed by the collective efforts of the community. Autumn branches laden with colorful leaves decorated the altar, Candles provided warm light that danced across the stone walls, and every pew was filled with faces that had become familiar and dear over the past month. But Sarah saw none of it. Once her eyes found Jake standing at the altar. He wore his best suit, a dark blue that complemented his weathered handsomeness, and his hair was slicked back with obvious care. What struck her most, though, was his expression. Gone was the quiet sadness that had marked him when they first met. In its place was a joy so profound it seemed to light him from within. Reverend Matthews, who had stayed in town specifically to perform the ceremony, beamed at the approaching bride. The elderly minister had taken a personal interest in their story, declaring that after 40 years of weddings, he'd never seen two people more meant for each other. "Dearly beloved," he began as Sarah reached Jake's side, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but redemption." The words were traditional, but Reverend Matthews spoke them with a warmth that made them feel entirely personal. As he talked about the sanctity of marriage and the courage required to open one's heart after experiencing loss, Sarah felt tears slipping down her cheeks. When it came time for vows, Jake's voice was steady and sure despite the emotion that shone in his eyes. "Sarah, when you walked into that chapel 3 weeks ago, you brought more than just shelter from a storm. You brought hope back into my life. I promise to love you and Emma as my own family, to protect you both with everything I have, and to build with you a future worthy of the courage you've shown in getting here." Sarah's voice trembled as she responded, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Jake, you saw me at my most desperate hour and chose to help rather than judge. You offered me not just your name but your heart, not just a home but a partnership. I promise to love you with the same generosity you've shown me, to stand beside you in whatever challenges we face, and to never forget that the best things in life are worth fighting for." The ring Jake slipped onto her finger was a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through generations of Morrison women who had built lives of love and purpose in this valley. As Sarah looked at it gleaming on her hand, she felt the weight of that legacy and the responsibility of carrying it forward. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado and the grace of Almighty God," Reverend Matthews declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, but it carried a promise of deeper intimacy to come. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, the chapel erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The reception, held in the town hall decorated with more autumn splendor, was a celebration unlike any Millbrook Valley had seen in years. The entire community had contributed something: food, music, decorations, or simply their joyful presence. Doc Henley played fiddle, the banker's wife had donated her finest china, and even the children had been enlisted to serve punch and cake to the guests. Sarah found herself passed from one congratulatory embrace to another, each person sharing their own story of second chances or expressing their pleasure at having her as a permanent member of their community. Mrs. Carmichael, who had initially been swayed by Thomas's lies, made a particular point of apologizing and welcoming Sarah to the local ladies' auxiliary. "We need more young women with backbone in this town," she declared. "That scoundrel Bradley never fooled me for long. A woman knows when she's hearing lies about another woman's character." Eleanor pulled Sarah aside during a lull in the festivities, her expression more serious than the occasion seemed to warrant. "I have a wedding gift for you that's more practical than sentimental," she said, pressing an envelope into Sarah's hands. "Jake's a good man, but he's never been much for business planning. That's a contract offering you a partnership in the dress shop, with the option to buy me out completely when you're ready." Sarah stared at the envelope, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "Eleanor, I can't possibly." "You can and you will," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "You've got the skills, the work ethic, and the vision to make this business thrive. More importantly, you've got the courage to build something lasting. Consider it an investment in Millbrook Valley's future. As the evening wound down and the guests began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing on the steps of the town hall with Jake, Emma asleep in her arms, and the sounds of cleanup and laughter drifting through the open doors behind them. No regrets? Jake asked quietly, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the town that had become their home. Only that I waited so long to find you, Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth. They walked slowly toward Jake's ranch, their ranch now following, a path lit by lanterns that the community had strung up as a surprise. The house that awaited them was modest but welcoming, with a nursery Jake had spent every spare hour preparing and a master bedroom, where a new marriage would begin to write its own story. As they crossed the threshold together, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain of Thomas's betrayal had seemed like the end of everything she'd hoped for, but it had actually been the beginning of something far better than her original dreams. The chapel where she'd sought shelter that stormy night was visible from their bedroom window, its simple cross silhouetted against the star-filled sky. She'd arrived there as a desperate woman with nothing but a baby and a prayer. She was leaving. As a wife, a business partner, and a valued member of a community that had chosen to see her strength rather than her struggles. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked, following her gaze to the chapel. "I'm thinking about churches," Sarah said, with a smile. "How they're supposed to be places where miracles happen, where people find exactly what they need, even when they don't know what to ask for." Jake pulled her closer, his voice warm with contentment. "Then I guess that old chapel did its job perfectly." Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her dark eyes to look up at the two people who would raise her with love, security, and the knowledge that families could be built on choice as well as blood. In the morning, they would begin their life together. In earnest, Jake would tend his horses, Sarah would open the dress shop, and Emma would grow up in a house filled with laughter and purpose. But tonight, as autumn wind whispered through the valley and candlelight flickered in the windows of their new home, Sarah Morrison fell asleep in her husband's arms, knowing that sometimes the most unexpected shelters became the strongest foundations, and that love, real love, was always worth the courage it took to begin again. The woman who had been left at the church door had found her way home at last, not to the place she'd started, but to the place she belonged. And in the morning, when Emma woke in her new nursery to the sound of her parents' voices planning their future together, she would begin her life in a house where being wanted was never a question, and where love was as steady and reliable as sunrise over the Colorado mountains. 2 years had transformed Sarah Morrison from a desperate woman seeking shelter into one of Millbrook Valley's most respected citizens. But the letter that arrived on a crisp October morning threatened to unravel everything she'd built. She stood in the kitchen of the ranch house she now called home, Emma playing at her feet while fresh bread cooled on the windowsill, and stared at the envelope bearing the return address of a law firm in Denver. Jake found her there when he came in from the morning chores, his work clothes dusty from feeding the horses, and his face bright with the contentment that had become his natural expression. The sight of Sarah's pale complexion and trembling hands immediately wiped the smile from his face. "What is it?" he asked, crossing the kitchen in 3 quick strides to place protective hands on her shoulders. "It's from Bradley's lawyer," Sarah sobbed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's being released from prison next month. Early release for good behavior." Jake's jaw tightened as he took the letter from her nerveless fingers, scanning the formal legal language that announced Thomas Bradley's impending return to society. The document was carefully worded, but its message was clear. Despite his conviction for fraud and forgery, Thomas would soon be free to resume his pursuit of what he considered his property. "He can't touch you," Jake said firmly, pulling Sarah into his arms. "You're my wife now. Emma is legally my daughter through adoption. We've got the protection of the law and this entire community." But Sarah had learned not to underestimate Thomas Bradley's capacity for causing harm. Even from prison, he'd managed to file appeals, hire new lawyers, and keep his case alive in the courts. The man who had abandoned her when she needed him. Most had spent 2 years nursing his grudges and planning his revenge. "He's contesting the adoption," Sarah said, her voice muffled against Jake's chest. "Claims he never consented to it and that his rights as Emma's biological father were violated." The kitchen fell silent except for Emma's happy babbling as she played with her wooden blocks, blissfully unaware of the storm clouds gathering around her small world. At nearly 3 years old, she was a bright, spirited child who called Jake Papa and had no memory of any father but the man who'd raised her with infinite patience and love. "We'll fight him," Jake said, his voice carrying the same quiet determination that had first drawn Sarah to him. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. Emma belongs with us." The next weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and community support that reminded Sarah why she'd fallen in love with Millbrook Valley in the first place. Eleanor closed the dress shop early several afternoons to accompany Sarah to meetings with their lawyer in Denver. Ruth organized a schedule among the women of the town to ensure Emma was never without loving supervision when Sarah and Jake had to deal with legal matters. Even Sheriff Hayes, who'd arrested Thomas 2 years earlier, made himself available to testify about the circumstances surrounding the forged marriage certificate. Their lawyer, Margaret Caldwell, was a formidable woman in her 50s who'd built her practice defending the rights of women and children in a legal system that often failed to protect them. She listened to Sarah's story with the sharp attention of someone who'd heard similar tales too many times. "The good news is that Mr. Bradley's criminal record works heavily in our favor," she explained during their first meeting. "Courts are reluctant to grant custody to convicted fraudsters, especially when the child has been thriving in a stable home environment." "And the bad news?" Jake asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Biological fathers have significant rights, even when they've been absent from a child's life. Bradley's lawyer will argue that he was prevented from exercising those rights by his incarceration, and that he deserves a chance to establish a relationship with his daughter." Sarah felt sick at the thought of Thomas anywhere near Emma, of his smooth lies corrupting her daughter's innocent world. The man who'd called Emma a burden and an inconvenience was now claiming paternal devotion with the same conviction he'd once used to forge marriage certificates. As November arrived with its first dusting of snow, so did Thomas Bradley. Sarah spotted him across Main Street one morning as she walked to the dress shop, his expensive clothes and practiced charm unchanged by his time in prison. He was talking to Mrs. Carmichael outside the general store, no doubt beginning another campaign to win public sympathy for his cause. That afternoon, he appeared at Eleanor's shop during the busy pre-holiday rush, his presence causing conversations to halt and customers to find sudden reasons to examine merchandise at the far end of the store. "Sarah," he said with the warm familiarity of an old friend, "you look wonderful. Motherhood and marriage clearly agree with you." "Mr. Bradley," Sarah replied coolly, not looking up from the hem she was pinning, "I heard you were back in town. Please, call me Thomas. After all, we share a daughter." He moved closer, and Sarah caught the scent of expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something darker underneath. "I was hoping we could talk privately about Emma's future." "Her future is already decided," Sarah said, finally meeting his eyes. "She has a loving family and a secure home. There's nothing to discuss." Thomas's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I think the courts might disagree. I've had 2 years to reflect on my mistake, Sarah. 2 years to realize what I lost when I let fear drive me away from you and our child." The carefully rehearsed words rolled off his tongue with practiced sincerity, but Sarah could see the calculation behind his eyes. This wasn't about love or regret. It was about winning, about proving that he could still control the narrative of their shared past. You didn't let fear drive you away, Sarah said quietly. You chose to leave because responsibility was inconvenient. Emma isn't a prize to be won back, Thomas. She's a little girl who deserves stability and genuine love. Love she'll get from her real father, Thomas replied, dropping his mask for just a moment to let his true nature show. Along with opportunities this backwater town could never provide. Private schools, travel, society connections that could open doors for her future. Eleanor appeared at Sarah's elbow with the perfect timing of someone who'd been listening from the back room. Mr. Bradley, I believe you've said what you came to say. Perhaps it's time you moved along. Thomas straightened his coat and tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Of course. Sarah, I'll be in touch through my lawyer. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that serves everyone's best interests. After he left, the shop felt like it was exhaling for the first time in minutes. The customers who'd remained pretended to return to their browsing, but Sarah could feel their sympathetic glances and protective presence. That man gives me the shivers, Eleanor said, locking the door firmly behind him. All charm on the surface and nothing but ambition underneath. The legal proceedings began in earnest after Thanksgiving, with depositions and hearings that forced Sarah to relive the darkest period of her life. Thomas's lawyer painted him as a reformed man seeking redemption through fatherhood, while Margaret Caldwell systematically dismantled his credibility with evidence of his continued dishonesty and manipulative behavior. The turning point came when Emma herself was brought to the judge's chambers for a private interview. At nearly 3 years old, she was too young to understand the legal implications, but old enough to clearly express her preferences and attachments. Sarah waded in the courthouse hallway with Jake, their hands clasped so tightly her fingers went numb. Through the closed door, they could hear Emma's bright chatter and occasional laughter, sounds that seemed impossibly precious in the sterile environment of legal proceedings. When the door finally opened, Judge Harrison emerged with Emma on his hip, the little girl chattering animatedly about her papa's horses and showing him the wooden horse Jake had carved for her. The sight of Emma so comfortable with the stern-faced judge gave Sarah the first real hope she'd felt in months. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Harrison said, transferring Emma to Sarah's eager arms, your daughter is clearly thriving in her current environment. She speaks fondly of both her parents and demonstrates none of the confusion or distress one might expect from a contested custody situation. The final hearing took place on a cold December morning, the courthouse filled with supporters from Millbrook Valley who'd made the journey to Denver despite the harsh weather. Sheriff Hayes testified about Thomas's criminal behavior. Eleanor spoke to Sarah's character and work ethic, and Dr. Henley provided medical testimony about Emma's excellent health and development under her current guardian's care. Thomas took the stand in his own defense, delivering a performance that would have impressed theater audiences with its displays of remorse and paternal longing. He spoke of sleepless nights in prison, tortured by regret over his abandonment of his family. He painted pictures of the life he could provide Emma: private tutors, European travel, entry into the finest social circles. But when Margaret Caldwell cross-examined him, the facade began to crack. She questioned his sudden interest in fatherhood, his continued financial instability, and his pattern of using legal manipulation to control situations. When she asked him to name Emma's favorite toy, her preferred bedtime story, or any detail of her daily routine, his ignorance became painfully obvious. Mr. Bradley, Margaret said in her closing argument, would have this court believe that biology trumps love, that DNA matters more than devotion. But Emma Morrison, and yes, that is legally her name now, has never known any father but Jake Morrison. She has never slept in any home but the one they've built together, never known any stability but what this family has provided. She gestured toward the gallery where the people of Millbrook Valley sat in silent support. This child isn't just loved by two parents. She's cherished by an entire community that has watched her grow, celebrated her milestones, and considers her welfare a sacred trust. Judge Harrison's decision, delivered after a recess that felt like eternity, was everything Sarah had prayed for but hardly dared to expect. "While I acknowledge Mr. Bradley's biological relationship to the child in question," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "I cannot ignore the compelling evidence that Emma's best interests lie in maintaining her current family structure. The Morrison family has provided stability, love, and security during the most formative years of this child's life." He looked directly at Thomas, his expression stern. "Mr. Bradley, your rights as a biological parent do not supersede your daughter's right to a stable, loving home. Your prolonged absence, criminal conviction, and demonstrated inability to provide emotional security weigh heavily against your petition." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Sarah felt Jake's arm tighten around her as relief flooded through her body. Emma would stay with them. Their family was safe. Thomas stormed from the courtroom without a word, his lawyer hurrying after him with papers clutched in his hands. Sarah never saw him again, though she heard later that he'd left Colorado entirely, moving on to pursue other schemes in other towns where his reputation hadn't preceded him. The ride home to Millbrook Valley was triumphant, with half the town waiting at the train station to welcome them back. Emma, exhausted by the long day, slept in Jake's arms while the community that had supported them through the crisis celebrated their victory. That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into her bed in the nursery Jake had built with his own hands, she marveled at how far they'd all come. The little girl who'd once been used as a weapon in Thomas's manipulative games was now a secure, happy child surrounded by people who genuinely loved her. "Mama," Emma said sleepily, clutching her wooden horse, "are we going home tomorrow?" "We are home, sweetheart," Sarah replied, brushing a kiss across her daughter's forehead. "We're already home." Later, as she and Jake sat by the fire in their living room, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. She'd come to Millbrook Valley as a desperate woman seeking shelter, never imagining she'd find not just safety but belonging, not just survival but love. "No more looking over our shoulders," Jake said, his voice soft with contentment. "No more wondering when the past might catch up with us. It's just us now building our future one day at a time." Sarah leaned into his warmth, watching the flames dance in the fireplace and listening to the wind whisper through the Colorado mountains outside their window. Somewhere in town, the chapel where she'd first found sanctuary stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely shelters became the strongest foundations for new beginnings. The woman who'd been left at the church door had not only found her way home, she'd helped create a home worth fighting for, worth defending, and worth sharing with the man who'd seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself. 5 years after the courthouse victory that secured Emma's future, Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway of her expanded dress shop, watching the bustling activity of Millbrook Valley's annual Harvest Festival. The town had grown considerably since her arrival, the railroad bringing new families and businesses that transformed the once quiet settlement into a thriving community. Yet despite all the changes, the heart of the place remained the same, a collection of people who chose to care for one another. Mrs. Morrison called Jenny Walsh, a young mother who'd moved to town just 6 months earlier with her husband and twin boys. "I wanted to thank you again for the alterations on David's school clothes. He's so proud to have pants that actually fit him properly." Sarah smiled, remembering her own days of struggling to make Emma's clothes last through growth spurts. Growing boys are a challenge for any seamstress. "I'm just glad I could help." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the apple bobbing booth, where Emma, now 8 years old and the unofficial leader of Millbrook Valley's children, was mediating a dispute between 2 younger boys over whose turn it was. "Next, Tommy had his turn already," Emma declared with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Peter gets to go next, then Mary, then it's back to the beginning of the line." Sarah watched with pride as her daughter handled the situation with fairness and kindness, traits that seemed to come as naturally to her as breathing. Emma had grown into a confident, compassionate child who moved through the world with the security that came from never doubting her place in it. "She's got your diplomatic skills," observed Eleanor Whitman, approaching with a cup of cider and the satisfied expression of someone whose protégé had exceeded all expectations. At 65, Eleanor had officially retired from the day-to-day operations of the dress shop, though she still came in several times a week to help in ways that usually involved critiquing Sarah's bookkeeping and rearranging the fabric displays. "She's got Jake's sense of justice," Sarah replied, accepting the cider gratefully. "Did you see her last week when the Henderson boy was picking on little Timothy? She marched right up to him and told him that real strength meant protecting people smaller than yourself, not bullying them." Eleanor chuckled. "That child has been listening to her father's life lessons. Speaking of Jake, where's that husband of yours? I saw him earlier helping set up the pie contest tables." Before Sarah could answer, a familiar voice called her name from across the festival grounds. She turned to see Margaret Caldwell approaching, the formidable lawyer who defended their family, now dressed in casual clothes and wearing the relaxed expression of someone enjoying a well-deserved vacation. "Margaret!" Sarah exclaimed, genuinely delighted to see the woman who'd become a dear friend in the years since the custody battle. "I didn't know you were coming to the festival. I was visiting my sister in Denver and couldn't resist the chance to see how my favorite family was doing," Margaret replied, embracing Sarah warmly. "Besides, I heard through the legal grapevine that you've been making quite a name for yourself in business circles." Sarah felt a flush of pride mixed with embarrassment. In the 5 years since taking over the dress shop, she'd expanded into a full clothing business that now supplied ready-made garments to stores throughout Colorado. What had started as a survival skill had evolved into a passion and then into an enterprise that employed 12 women and supported their families. "It's been quite a journey," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how far we've come from that night in the chapel." "Speaking of journeys," Margaret said, her expression becoming more serious, "I have some news that you should know about. It concerns Thomas Bradley." Sarah felt the familiar chill that still accompanied any mention of Emma's biological father, though the fear was more memory than present concern now. "What about him? He died 6 months ago in San Francisco. Pneumonia, complicated by his lifestyle choices." Margaret's voice was professionally neutral, but her eyes held sympathy for the complex emotion such news might evoke. "I thought you should hear it from a friend rather than stumble across it in some legal document." The information hit Sarah with unexpected force, not grief, exactly, but a strange sense of closure mixed with relief. Thomas Bradley had been absent from their lives for years, but his existence had always represented a potential threat, a shadow that might someday fall across their happiness again. Did he leave any family? Anyone who might? Sarah couldn't finish the question, but Margaret understood. "No wife, no other children that we could find. His parents disowned him years ago after his conviction. You and Emma are finally completely free of any connection to him." Eleanor squeezed Sarah's shoulder supportively. "How do you feel about this news, dear?" Sarah considered the question carefully, watching Emma demonstrate the proper apple-bobbing technique to a group of younger children. "Sad, I suppose, for the waste of it all. Thomas could have been part of something beautiful if he'd chosen differently, but mostly relieved that Emma will never have to worry about him disrupting her life again. Will you tell her?" Margaret asked. "When she's older and can understand the complexity of it all," Sarah decided. "For now, Jake is her father in every way that matters. She doesn't need to carry the burden of Thomas's story." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake himself, leading a magnificent black stallion that drew admiring glances from everyone nearby. At 35, Jake had grown into his role as one of Millbrook Valley's most respected citizens, serving on the town council and expanding his horse breeding operation into one of the most successful in the territory. "Sorry I'm late," he said, tying the stallion securely to a post before greeting the women with the easy charm that had only grown more pronounced over the years. Thunder here decided to test every fence on the property before agreeing to come to town. "He's beautiful," Margaret said admiringly. "Is this the horse Emma's been begging to ride?" Jake's expression mixed pride with paternal concern. "She's not quite ready for Thunder yet, but she's making good progress with Gentle Ben. Give her another year or two, and she'll be able to handle any horse we've got." Emma appeared at that moment, as if summoned by the mention of horses, her face flushed with excitement and her dress only slightly disheveled from her festival activities. "Papa, can I show Mrs. Caldwell the tricks you taught me?" she asked, bouncing on her toes with barely contained energy. "After the pie judging." Jake promised. "Your mother and Mrs. Whitman have been working all week on their entries, and they deserve a proper audience." The pie contest had become something of a legendary rivalry between Sarah and several other women in town, each year bringing new innovations and increasingly creative interpretations of traditional recipes. Sarah's entry this year was an apple cranberry creation with a lattice crust that had taken her 3 attempts to perfect. As they made their way to the judging area, Sarah reflected on how naturally their family had settled into the rhythms of small-town life. Jake served as a volunteer firefighter and helped organize the annual cattle drive. Sarah had joined the school board and the ladies' auxiliary. Emma participated in every childhood activity Millbrook Valley had to offer, from spelling bees to church choir. Yet their contentment went deeper than mere civic involvement. They'd built something rare and precious, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection that had only deepened with time. Jake still brought her wildflowers from the meadow behind their house. Sarah still mended his work shirts with the same care she'd once given to expensive gowns. They still sat on their front porch after Emma went to bed, talking about their day and planning for tomorrow. The pie judging proved to be as competitive as expected, with Sarah's creation earning second place behind Ruth Morrison's innovative pumpkin bourbon combination. As they celebrated Ruth's victory, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with belonging. "You know," Margaret said as they walked back toward the main festival area, "watching your family today reminds me why I do the work I do. It's not just about legal victories, it's about protecting the chance for people to build lives like this." Before Sarah could respond, a young woman approached hesitantly, clutching a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. She was clearly exhausted, her clothes travel-worn and her eyes holding the desperate hope that Sarah recognized from her own past. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Mrs. Morrison? Mrs. Whitman said you might be able to help me. I'm looking for work and I have seamstress experience. I can provide references from back east, and I'm willing to work for room and board until I can get established." Sarah looked at the young mother, probably no older than she herself had been when she'd arrived in Millbrook Valley, and saw her own story reflected in the woman's desperate courage. "What's your name?" Sarah asked gently. "Rebecca Foster." "This is my son, Daniel." The woman's voice strengthened slightly. "My husband died in a mining accident 3 months ago. I've been traveling west, looking for somewhere to start over." Sarah glanced at Jake, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his understanding expression. Emma, who'd been listening with the intense concentration children brought to adult conversations they didn't quite understand, stepped forward. "We have a guest room," Emma announced with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her family's capacity for kindness. "And Mama's always saying she needs more help at the shop." Rebecca Foster looked as if she might cry from relief, and Sarah remembered exactly how that felt, The overwhelming gratitude that came when strangers chose to see potential rather than problems. The guest room comes with breakfast and sundae. Dinner, Sarah said, making the decision with the same instinctive certainty that had guided her best choices. We can discuss work arrangements tomorrow, but tonight you should rest and let the community welcome you properly. As they walked Rebecca toward their house, Margaret fell into step beside Sarah. You realize you just proved my point about why your story matters, she said quietly. You're not just living a good life, you're passing on the chance for others to do the same. That evening, after Rebecca and baby Daniel had been settled in the guest room, and Emma had finally exhausted herself with festival excitement, Sarah and Jake sat on their front porch watching the stars emerge over the mountains. The sounds of the festival's conclusion drifted up from town families calling their children home, vendors packing up their booths, the satisfied chatter of a community that had celebrated together. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Sarah asked, though she already knew Jake's answer. Taking in Rebecca and her baby? I think we're doing what was done for us, Jake replied, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Giving someone a chance to discover what they're capable of when they're not fighting just to survive. Emma seemed to take it for granted that we'd help. Jake chuckled softly. That child has never known a world where people in need aren't welcomed. She thinks that's just how families work. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Sarah mused. Maybe. That's exactly the world we should be raising her to expect. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the valley and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the evening. Sarah thought about Thomas Bradley, whose death had officially closed a chapter of their lives that had been functionally finished for years. She thought about the journey that had brought her from that desperate night in the chapel to this moment of perfect contentment. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently? She asked. If Thomas had stayed, if we'd never met, if I'd given up and gone back to my parents? Jake considered the question seriously, as he always did when she posed these occasional philosophical puzzles. I think we would have found each other somehow, he said finally. Maybe not the same way, maybe not at the same time, but I believe. Some things are meant to be. That's very romantic for a practical cowboy, Sarah teased. You've made me romantic, Jake replied, lifting their joined hands to brush a kiss across her knuckles. Among other things I never thought I'd be again. The next morning brought the familiar routines of a working ranch and a growing business. But now with the added pleasure of watching Rebecca Foster discover that her new life might hold possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Emma appointed herself the baby's unofficial guardian, bringing toys and offering to help with feeding in a serious way. Children approached important responsibilities. As Sarah watched her daughter gently rock baby Daniel while Rebecca worked on alterations in the shop, she realized that their story was no longer just about survival or even success. It had become about legacy, about the kind of life they were modeling for Emma, and the kind of community they were helping to build for future generations, who might also arrive seeking shelter and second chances. The woman who'd once been left at a church door had become someone who opened doors for others, and in doing so, had discovered that the greatest security came not from building walls, but from creating circles wide enough to include whoever needed them most. 10 years had passed since Rebecca Foster first arrived at the Harvest Festival with baby Daniel, and she now stood beside Sarah in the newly expanded Morrison Clothing Company, reviewing orders that would ship to stores from Denver to San Francisco. What had begun as a small dress shop had evolved into one of Colorado's most successful garment manufacturers, employing nearly 50 people and supporting families throughout the valley. The Chicago order is our largest yet, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd grown from desperate refugee to trusted business partner. 300 work dresses and 200 children's outfits. We'll need to hire at least 6 more seamstresses to meet the deadline. Sarah nodded, still sometimes amazed by the scope of what they'd built together. At 37, She'd become a prominent businesswoman whose innovations in ready-made clothing had earned respect far beyond Millbrook Valley's borders. Yet success hadn't changed the fundamental values that had guided her from the beginning. Fair wages, quality craftsmanship, and the belief that work could be both profitable and purposeful. "What about training?" Sarah asked, reviewing the production schedules spread across her desk. "We can't just hire more hands, we need skilled ones." "I've been thinking about that," Rebecca replied, settling into the chair across from Sarah with the easy familiarity of a decade-long partnership. "What if we started a formal apprenticeship program? Partner with the schools to teach young women practical skills while they're still completing their education." The idea sparked Sarah's imagination immediately. She'd always believed that economic independence was the foundation of women's freedom, having learned that lesson through bitter experience. A training program could provide that foundation for a new generation of young women in the valley. "We could start with Emma's class," Sarah mused. "She's 15 now, old enough to learn real skills alongside her regular studies." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma herself, home from school and radiating the kind of barely contained energy that marked her teenage years. Tall for her age and blessed with Jake's steady disposition, tempered by Sarah's determined spirit. She'd grown into a young woman who commanded attention without seeking it. "Mama, Mrs. Caldwell is here to see you," Emma announced, her expression suggesting this wasn't a social call. "She's got that serious look she gets when there's important business to discuss." Margaret Caldwell appeared in the doorway, her silver hair impeccably styled and her traveling dress suggesting she'd come directly from the train station. At 65, the formidable lawyer had expanded her practice to include business law, representing several of the most successful women entrepreneurs in the territory. "Sarah, Rebecca," Margaret greeted them warmly before her expression grew serious. "I'm afraid I have news that requires immediate attention. There's been a development regarding your business that could affect everything you've built here." Sarah felt the familiar chill that accompanied unexpected legal complications. "What kind of development?" Margaret settled into a chair and opened her leather portfolio with practiced efficiency. "A consortium of Eastern businessmen has filed a claim asserting that women-owned businesses operating across state lines require male oversight to be legally valid. They're targeting successful enterprises like yours as test cases." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. After everything they'd overcome, after all the years of careful legal compliance and community support, someone was challenging their right to exist as independent businesswomen. "That's ridiculous," Rebecca said indignantly. "We've operated legally for years. We pay our taxes, follow all regulations, employ dozens of people, none of which matters if the courts decide that women lack the legal capacity to enter interstate commerce without male guardians," Margaret interrupted grimly. "This consortium isn't interested in fairness or logic. They want to eliminate competition from businesses they can't control or absorb." Emma, who'd been listening with the intense concentration she brought to adult conversations, stepped forward with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "What would happen if they win? Would we lose everything?" Margaret's expression softened as she looked at the teenager whose future hung in the balance. "If they succeed, your mother and Rebecca would be forced to either close the business or place it under male ownership. All the work they've done, all the women they employ, it could all disappear." The office fell silent except for the sound of sewing machines humming in the adjacent workroom, where dozens of women were creating beautiful clothing while supporting their families. Sarah thought of all the young mothers who'd found stability through employment at Morrison Clothing, all the families who depended on the wages her company provided. "We'll fight this," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same determination that had carried her through every previous crisis. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. We won't let them destroy what we've built." "I was hoping you'd say that," Margaret replied with a smile that didn't quite hide her concern. But you should understand this won't be like your custody battle with Thomas Bradley. This is about challenging fundamental assumptions about women's rights in business. We'll be fighting not just for your company, but for the principle that women can be full participants in the economy. Over the following weeks, news of the lawsuit spread through Millbrook Valley and beyond, sparking heated debates about women's roles in society and business. The local newspaper, now edited by Carolyn Watson, the former schoolteacher who'd married the publisher, provided detailed coverage that framed the issue as a battle for the community's economic future. Support came from unexpected quarters. Jake organized a meeting of local businessmen who signed a petition affirming their confidence in Morrison Clothing Company's management and leadership. Eleanor Whitman, despite being officially retired, penned a series of letters to newspapers throughout Colorado defending women's business acumen. Even Sheriff Hayes, now in his 60s, but still respected throughout the territory, spoke publicly about the economic benefits Sarah's company had brought to the region, but opposition was equally vocal. Conservative voices in Denver and beyond used the case to argue that women's increasing independence threatened the natural order of society. Editorial writers questioned whether female business owners could be trusted with important economic decisions. Some former customers canceled orders, citing concerns about supporting improper female ambition. The stress of the situation took its toll on the entire Morrison family. Sarah found herself working late into the night, poring over legal documents and business records to prepare for depositions. Jake took on additional responsibilities at home and the ranch, while also serving as an unofficial spokesman for the company in meetings with suppliers and distributors who were nervous about the ongoing litigation. Emma, meanwhile, threw herself into supporting the cause with the passionate intensity that only teenagers could muster. She organized her classmates to write letters to newspapers, started a petition drive among the valley's younger residents, and even convinced the school board to invite guest speakers who could address the importance of women's economic participation. "You know," Emma said one evening as the family gathered for dinner, "this whole lawsuit might actually help us in the long run." Sarah looked up from her barely touched meal, exhausted from another day of legal consultations. "How do you figure that?" "Because now everyone's talking about what we've accomplished," Emma explained with the clear logic of someone who'd inherited her mother's strategic thinking. "Before this, people just knew we made good clothes. Now they know we've built something important enough that powerful men want to destroy it." Jake smiled proudly at his daughter's insight. "She's got a point. Sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to show how hard others will fight to diminish it." The legal proceedings moved forward through the winter and into spring, with depositions and hearings that required frequent trips to Denver and occasionally to federal court in Kansas. Margaret had assembled a team of lawyers who specialized in business and constitutional law, arguing that the plaintiffs' claims violated principles of interstate commerce and individual liberty. Sarah's testimony proved to be a crucial moment in the case. Facing a courtroom filled with skeptical male lawyers and judges, she spoke about her journey from desperate single mother to successful entrepreneur, emphasizing the economic benefits her company had created for the entire region. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "Morrison Clothing Company employs 53 people directly and supports countless others through our supply chain and retail partnerships. We've contributed over $40,000 in taxes to local and territorial governments. We've innovated manufacturing processes that have been adopted by companies throughout the West." She paused, looking directly at the judge who would help decide their fate. "The question before this court isn't whether women are capable of running successful businesses. We've already proven that. The question is whether success achieved through hard work, innovation, and ethical practices can be taken away simply because the achievers happen to be female." The opposing counsel's cross-examination was aggressive. attempting to paint Sarah as an anomaly whose success depended on male assistance and guidance. But Margaret had prepared her well, and Sarah deflected each attack with specific examples of decisions she'd made independently, problems she'd solved through her own expertise, and innovations she'd developed without masculine input. When Rebecca took the stand the following day, she provided powerful testimony about the opportunities Morrison Clothing had created for women throughout the valley. Her own transformation from desperate widow to successful business partner illustrated the broader social benefits of women's economic participation. Before joining Morrison Clothing, I was dependent on charity, Rebecca told the court. Now, I own my own home, my son attends the best schools in the territory, and I employ 3 other women in my division of the company. This isn't just about one business, it's about the kind of society we want to build. Emma, though too young to testify formally, attended every hearing and took detailed notes that she shared with the local newspaper. Her articles, published under the byline, "A Young Woman's Perspective," provided eloquent commentary on the proceedings and their implications for her generation. "Today I watched my mother defend not just her business, but my future," she wrote after Sarah's testimony. "The men in that courtroom see successful women as threats to their power, but we see ourselves as proof that talent and determination matter more than gender. Whatever the court decides, they can't take away what we've already accomplished or the knowledge that women can build something extraordinary when given the chance." The final arguments took place on a warm day in late spring, with supporters from Millbrook Valley filling the courtroom galleries. Margaret delivered a passionate closing statement that connected their specific case to broader principles of American freedom and opportunity. "This case will determine whether the United States is truly a land of opportunity for all its citizens, or whether half our population will be permanently relegated to economic dependence," she argued. "Morrison Clothing Company represents everything. We claim to value innovation, hard work, job creation, and community development. To destroy it because its leaders are women would be to abandon the very principles that make our nation great." The opposing counsel's closing argument relied heavily on traditional gender roles and concerns about social stability, arguing that women's business ownership undermined family structures and natural hierarchies. Their presentation felt dated and defensive compared to Margaret's vision of expanded opportunity and economic growth. Judge Harrison, the same man who'd presided over the custody case years earlier, listened to both sides with careful attention before announcing that he would issue his decision within 2 weeks. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah felt the weight of uncertainty that came with knowing that everything they'd built hung in the balance of one man's interpretation of law and justice. The weight was agonizing. Business operations continued, but with an undercurrent of anxiety that affected everyone from the newest apprentices to the most experienced seamstresses. Orders began to slow as customers adopted a wait-and-see attitude, and suppliers grew nervous about extending credit to a company whose future remained uncertain. It was Emma who suggested they use the waiting period productively by expanding their apprenticeship program, regardless of the lawsuit's outcome. "If we win, we'll need trained workers for our expansion," she reasoned. "If we lose, at least we'll have given more young women skills they can use wherever they go." The wisdom of her suggestion became clear when 12 young women from across the valley applied for the first class of apprentices. Their enthusiasm and eagerness to learn reminded Sarah why the fight was worth continuing, regardless of the personal cost or professional risk. On a Tuesday morning in June, word came that Judge Harrison was ready to announce his decision. Sarah, Jake, Emma, Rebecca, and Margaret made the familiar journey to Denver, joined by a delegation from Millbrook Valley that included Eleanor, Sheriff Hayes, and nearly 20 other supporters who'd taken time from their own work to witness the verdict. As they gathered in the courthouse that had become so familiar over the past months, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come from that desperate night when she'd sought shelter in a small chapel. Whatever happened today, they'd proven that women could build something remarkable when given the chance. And that success earned through honest effort deserved protection under the law. The future of Morrison Clothing Company and the economic independence of women throughout the territory now rested in the hands of justice, and all they could do was wait to see whether their faith in American principles would be vindicated or betrayed. Judge Harrison entered the packed courtroom with the measured stride of a man who understood the weight of his decision. Sarah sat between Jake and Emma, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the judge settled behind his bench and surveyed the sea of faces that had gathered to witness this moment that would shape the future of women's business rights in Colorado Territory. In the matter of the Eastern Commerce Consortium versus Morrison Clothing Company, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. This court has given considerable thought to the fundamental questions raised by this case. He paused, adjusting his spectacles before continuing. The plaintiffs argue that women lack the legal capacity to engage in interstate commerce without male oversight. They contend that allowing such independence undermines social order and exceeds the bounds of traditional feminine roles. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The judge's tone revealed nothing of his intentions, and she forced herself to breathe steadily despite the crushing anxiety. However, Judge Harrison continued, this court finds their arguments fundamentally flawed and contrary to both territorial law and American principles of individual liberty. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the courtroom's supporters section. Sarah felt Jake's hand squeeze hers as hope began to bloom in her chest. Morrison Clothing Company has operated for over a decade with exemplary legal compliance, exceptional business practices, and demonstrated economic benefit to the entire region. The evidence shows that Mrs. Morrison and Mrs. Foster have built their enterprise through skill, innovation, and ethical leadership qualities that have no gender requirements under the law. The judge's voice grew stronger, more definitive. Furthermore, this court recognizes that economic participation is fundamental to citizenship. To deny women the right to engage in lawful commerce would effectively create a separate and inferior class of citizens, a concept wholly incompatible with American ideals of equality and opportunity. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. As the judge delivered his final verdict, the plaintiff's petition is denied in its entirety. Morrison Clothing Company will continue to operate under its current ownership and management structure. This court further enjoins any similar challenges based solely on the gender of business owners. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the Millbrook Valley delegation. Emma threw her arms around Sarah, while Jake's weathered face split into the widest grin she'd ever seen. Margaret Caldwell, ever professional even in triumph, simply nodded with satisfaction at a job well done. As they emerged from the courthouse into the bright Colorado sunshine, Sarah felt the same sense of miraculous transformation she'd experienced on her wedding day. Once again, justice had prevailed over prejudice, and the future had opened up in ways she'd barely dared to imagine. "We did it," Rebecca said, her voice filled with wonder. "We actually did it." "No," Emma corrected, her young voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "You paved the way. Now it's up to us to build on what you've created." The train ride back to Millbrook Valley was triumphant, with spontaneous celebrations breaking out in every car as word of the victory spread among the passengers. Fellow travelers who'd never heard of Morrison Clothing Company found themselves toasting the decision that had affirmed women's rights to economic independence. When they arrived at the station, it seemed the entire town had gathered to welcome them home. A banner stretched across Main Street reading, "Congratulations Morrison Clothing Company, pride of Millbrook Valley." Children scattered flower petals, the band played patriotic songs, and Mayor Henderson delivered a speech declaring, "It the greatest day in our community's history." That evening, as the celebrations finally wound down, the Morrison family gathered on their front porch to watch the sunset, paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Emma sat between her parents, no longer the baby who'd once slept in their arms, but a young woman ready to inherit the legacy they'd built together. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her voice thoughtful. "With the business, I mean, now that we've won." Sarah considered the question carefully. "Now we do what we've always done. We work hard, treat people fairly, and prove that success comes from character rather than gender. But more importantly, we help other women who want to build something of their own." "Speaking of building," Jake said with a smile that suggested he'd been keeping a secret, "I've been talking to the territorial legislature about a proposal that might interest you." Sarah turned to him with raised eyebrows. "What kind of proposal?" "They want to establish a women's business training institute," Jake explained. "A place where women from across the territory could come to learn skills like bookkeeping, business law, and management. They've asked if Morrison Clothing Company would be willing to serve as the founding sponsor." The idea took Sarah's breath away. After years of fighting for the right to exist as a women-owned business, they were being asked to help other women claim that same independence. "It would mean expanding again," Rebecca pointed out practically. "More responsibility, more risk." "More opportunity," Emma countered. "Imagine what dozens of women could accomplish if they had the training and support to start their own businesses." Sarah looked out over the valley that had become their home, thinking of the journey that had brought them from that desperate night in the chapel to this moment of unprecedented possibility. Every challenge they'd faced had made them stronger. Every victory had opened doors for others to follow. "Yes," she said simply. "We'll do it." 5 years later, the Morrison Women's Business Institute had trained over 200 women in practical business skills, helping them start enterprises from bakeries to bookkeeping services throughout Colorado and beyond. Emma, now 20 and a graduate of the institute herself, managed the program with the same passion for justice that had driven her mother's journey. Sarah, at 42, had been appointed to the Territorial Business Council and frequently traveled to Denver to consult on policies affecting women's economic participation. The girl who'd once been dismissed as a fallen woman was now recognized as one of the territory's most influential business leaders. Jake continued to raise horses and serve on the town council, but his proudest role remained that of husband and father to the family that had transformed his understanding of what love could build. The quiet cowboy who'd offered shelter to a desperate woman had discovered that true strength came from nurturing others' dreams alongside your own. On a warm spring evening, as 3 generations of the Morrison family gathered for Sunday dinner, Sarah's granddaughter, Emma's newborn daughter, slept peacefully in the same cradle that had once held Emma herself. The cycle of protection, love, and opportunity would continue, each generation building on the foundation of courage and determination that had started with a desperate prayer in a small chapel. Rebecca's son Daniel, now grown and married, worked as the company's chief financial officer alongside his mother, proving that the benefits of women's economic independence extended to entire families and communities. The Morrison Clothing Company employed over 150 people, and the Business Institute had become a model replicated in territories across the American West. As Sarah rocked her granddaughter and watched the sunset paint the familiar mountains in brilliant colors, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her family to this moment of perfect contentment. The woman who'd been left at a church door with nothing but hope and determination had built a legacy that would outlast any individual life. The chapel where it all began still stood on the hill overlooking Millbrook Valley, its simple cross a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely shelters became the strongest foundations for dreams beyond imagining. And in the town below, the Morrison Women's Business Institute welcomed new students each month, young women carrying their own hopes and fears, ready to discover what they could build when given the chance to succeed. Sarah's story had become larger than her own life, woven into the fabric of a community that had chosen to see potential rather than problems. Opportunity rather than obstacles. The baby who'd once cried in an empty chapel had grown into a woman whose own daughter would inherit a world where being female was no barrier to achievement, where independence was a birthright rather than a privilege to be granted by others. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't the legal battles won or the businesses built, but the simple truth that love, when combined with courage and community support, could transform any ending into a beginning, any shelter into a home, and any dream into a legacy that would endure long after the dreamers themselves had become part of the story they'd helped to write. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.